Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Ukraine, and the United States. Now, today there was, or within, I would rather say, the last 24 hours, there was a series of missile strikes that were launched by the Ukrainian military. Now, I'm saying the Ukrainian military. The reality is those missile strikes that were launched against targets within the vicinity of Sevastopol were actually launched by the United States and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. 5 ATACMS missiles were launched towards targets within the vicinity of Sevastopol. The Russians were able to bring down approximately 4 of those missiles, and one of those missiles, one of those ATACMS, struck a park to the northwest of Sevastopol. It actually struck this beachfront park, reportedly killing 4 people and injuring dozens and dozens of persons. So why did this ATACMS, this Western missile, this missile designed and produced in the United States, why did it strike this civilian park? Was it an intended strike by the Ukrainian military and by the Western powers to target civilians? Well, the answer to that question is categorically no. The West, the United States, would not use a very expensive ATACMS missile to attack civilians in a park on the beach. It serves no military purpose unless there was an encampment of Russian military personnel at that locale. And it seems kind of doubtful at this point. What in all probability happened was through Russian electronic warfare and possibly a direct missile strike by an S-400 system, S-300 system, or other missile system that the Russians have, caused that missile to deviate and then strike within the vicinity of this park. But this is what is going to happen. This is how this conflict is steadily escalating. Now, the Russians are absolutely livid over this strike. Now, would it be different if it was, say, a modified Ukrainian Neptune missile that was launched at a military target in the Crimean Peninsula? Well, the problem is in all probability, the Neptune is a fairly slow-moving weapon system, and the Russians would have intercepted it before it got within the strike vicinity of Sevastopol. It would have probably been shot down over a very sparsely populated area. Now, with the ATACMS, obviously this is a semi-ballistic missile traveling at an incredible rate of speed. A normally very precise weapon system, but in this case, the strike of these 5 ATACMS was foiled by Russian forces. Now, look, there's a lot of very lucrative military targets. If we look at the park that was struck and we just kind of work our way outwards, you're going to see what looks to be very military or military-like targets just to the north of the city. And this airbase here, this airbase has been hit prior, I do believe, but it does have a very robust air defense network right now protecting the area around Sevastopol. And this is a target, in all probability, that the United States was looking to target. And look, when I say the United States, anytime the Ukrainians are going to use an ATACMS, the United States knows that is about to take place. A couple of different reasons. The targeting data. Most of the time, unless it is a frontline attack taking place along the line of contact. If it is a deep area strike hitting targets, say in Crimea, Sevastopol, targets near Belgorod, other places inside the Russian Federation, then authorization for that strike has to come through the United States. The targeting data, the specific target that ATACMS is going to strike is provided by the United States. The sensory information, the intel that tells the Ukrainians, hey, we believe there is a Russian command and control node, there is a force buildup in this area, there are weapon systems, high-valued weapon systems that we want to strike. Look, that information is coming from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is coming from mainly sensory intelligence from either the French, the United Kingdom, or the United States. So that information is provided to the Ukrainians, and then the inputs and the coordinates and then the authorization to use the ATACMS is then coming from the United States. Believe you me, the Ukrainians right now just do not have the ability to launch an independent ATACMS strike against Russian targets. They don't. It is a strategic weapon system that the U.S. has provided to the Ukrainians that is now being used in this conflict. And the Russians are getting fed up. Now, I talked about before the possibility of an asymmetrical strike against Western powers. Look, that's a high probability when that's going to come. And believe you me, it is going to come. It is absolutely going to happen. The Russians are going to respond. Now, additionally, the Russians are continuing to prepare for a very large-scale conflict. 5 to 8% of the Russian GDP is now going towards military capacity. At the onset of this conflict, the Russians were spending around 60 billion US dollars per year on its military. At the very minimum, right now, it is between 80 billion and quite possibly as high as $140 billion. So essentially, the Russian defense budget may have doubled since the beginning of this conflict. And that's quite a bit. And not only that, the Russians are preparing for further conflict, especially in its ability to produce weapon systems. Its military is continuing to grow. In another year or two, the Russian army is going to be many times bigger than the Russian army that started this conflict. You're probably looking at a ground forces, just the ground forces, not taking into account the naval infantry forces, the airborne forces, the Russian National Guard, just the ground forces. You're probably looking at a force in excess of 1.2 million personnel. A massive army. Now, when this war resolves itself, the current fighting that is taking place in the Ukraine, and it will eventually end at some point. Is it going to end in a year? Is it going to end in 5 years? Difficult to say. It's a war of attrition. But the Russian state that exists right now cannot lose this conflict. It can't. And it understands that. It cannot lose this conflict. It has no choice but to win this conflict. So if that takes cranking up GDP to 10, 12, 15%, it'll do that. The Russians will do that to win this conflict. That's how important it is to the Russians. They have no choice but to win this war. And that's their war goal. Now, how far that extends and what that looks like right now, it's difficult to say. Difficult to say. But it's going to happen. Now, the Russian army that's going to exist post-Ukrainian war is going to be a threat to the Baltic states. It will become a threat to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, especially with the merging of this Sino-Russian, North Korean, Iranian alliance. I've talked about this before. This U.S. administration, this unitary one-party state, under the figurehead, Joseph Biden, has created the largest defense alliance against the United States in human history. I'm talking about capacity. Capacity. Look, we can go back to World War II and we can say, okay, the Axis powers, the Germans, the Japanese, and the Italians were a formidable alliance. And it took years to defeat the Germans, the Japanese. Millions of casualties. The Sino-Russian, North Korean, Iranian alliance, in terms of capacity, in terms of military-industrial complex, in terms of sheer manpower. China, 1.3 billion people. The Russians, including Belarus, over 150 million people. The German Reich at the time, during World War II, had about 80 million people at its peak. 80 million, including Austria and Germany. The Russians alone have 150 million people, with vastly more both industry and natural resources than the Germans could even ever have fathomed. And then combining that, you have 1.4 billion Chinese. You have the North Korean state, obviously 20 some odd million people, but a completely militarized state. And then you have Iran, which is also a fairly militarized state with a vast pool of manpower. So again, the largest military alliance in human history in terms of if these nation states, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, go on a total war footing. And we start to progress towards total global war. And we're heading in that direction. The relationship right now between the United States and Russia is much, much worse than any time during the Soviet times. And you have to look, during obviously the Soviet Union, there was a big ideology gap. Obviously you had communism and Western capitalism. I would say at this point, in terms of culture, in terms of ideology, the average Russian and the average American is there's not that gap. It doesn't exist. Not like it did during the days of old communism. I would say that the current cabal that runs the U.S. government now is more in line to Soviet communism and Soviet state control than what you see now in terms of ideology in the Russian Federation. the Russian economy is doing very well right now. If you were to look around the suburbs of Moscow into other cities, you will see vibrant growth in single-family homes being built. It's really incredible in terms of the way Russia looks now as opposed to the way Russia looked during Soviet times. Again, it's gravitated more towards a free market economy. Businesses are thriving. Homes are being built, as I just mentioned. So again, it looks a lot different than what it did. But at the same time, these two nation states, Russia, the United States, the disunited states, is probably as close now to open global conflict than at any point in history. I would say far more in terms of tension that exists between Russia and the United States, the disunited states, now than at any point during the Cold War. I have to ask myself, what would happen if Joseph Biden, the figurehead, was in power during the Cuban Missile Crisis? And I got to tell you, I firmly believe that we would now probably be fighting each other with muskets and swords. Because that incompetent fool, without a doubt, the worst president, the most incompetent president in the history of the United States, would have gotten us into a third world war if he was transplanted back into power during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But realistically, he's not running the country. We don't know who is running the country right now here in the United States. Look, this guy cannot tie his shoes. He can barely walk around. And unfortunately for us here in the United States, we have no idea who's calling the shots. None. Zero. And because the population has been dumbed down, most of the population of the United States is now an uninformed urbanite who is more invested in popular culture than current events and what's happening around him. We are in a bad space, and we're heading towards even a worse space. So again, U.S. ATACMS missile strike on a Russian target. Russians shot down those missiles, hit a civilian area, killed a bunch of civilians, wounded a bunch of civilians, and the march towards global war continues. More to come. As always, thank you for joining us. Have a good day.